Thanks for having me today, Daisy. I'm Sam Riley. I volunteer for the Young Rail Professionals, so I'm currently the head of corporate relations for the Young Rail Professionals, and then day job wise I run a recruitment division for digital engineering for advanced TRS.
Morning everyone, I'm Lorna Gibson. I am the Managing Director of QTS Training, which is a subsidiary of the QTS Group, which is a large UK-wide rail engineering contractor. I'm also Chair of Women in Rail Scotland and Vice Chair of the Rail Industry Association Scotland.
Hi everyone, Odis Palmer, Industry Inclusion Belonging Lead at the DFTO, also co-chair of the Group Rail Nights for Inclusion, which covers all the rail sector in terms of inclusivity, on the non-exec board of directors for Gloucester Oxford Community Rail Partnerships. I'll stop there, but yeah, nice to meet you all.
Told you, a fantastic panel. So the way we're going to play this is we're going to have a few questions that we're going to discuss as a group for maybe 20, 30 minutes, and then we're going to open out to the audience for questions. So as we're talking, please do be thinking if you have any questions you'd like to ask, and we will make sure to get a microphone to you when the time comes. But first, we will kick off with, I think, a pretty obvious question of what are the trends in youth employment generally, but also bringing more young people into the rail sector? And do we have barriers? And do we understand those barriers? So a fairly chunky question. Who'd like to kick us off?
Do you want me to start?
Please do.
So I think we've got at the moment 6% of the rail workforce is aged between 16 and 25. And that's a reduction because I believe back in 2016 it was 10%. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a falling trend of bringing in 16 to 24-year-olds. But there's 12% of the population are 16 to 24, so we're running well under what's out there in the general population. And then in terms of youth employment, there's a reduction at the moment in youth employment. So there's 900,000 people who are 16 to 25 who are not in education, employment or training, which is a large number, so a real opportunity there. And of that group of people, the common theme for those that have been NEET for over a year is that the marginalised groups, the ones who are most likely to be in that position, are people from the Black, Pakistani and Bangladeshi community, care leavers, those with mental health issues, autism and neurodiversity, and those who've experienced the criminal justice system. So there are some real barriers out there to employment for big groups of people, which I think we can do a lot more to address because we're not doing that within the rail industry. And as an industry that's got, for many of our roles, quite a low barrier to entry in terms of skills and qualifications and geographically spread across the country, there's a really big opportunity there that we're not making the most of at the moment. I think it's only 2,000 people last year were on an apprenticeship in the rail industry, which is tiny given the fact that we're about 250,000 employees across the companies in rail.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's where the question mark of why is that percentage so low really comes in. So if we know that the barriers, there must be barriers, what are the barriers? So I'll open that up to the rest of the panel.
If I could come in there. QTS run a Real Skills Academy, which actually is aimed at exactly the type of young people that you've just mentioned, that have got barriers to work, are experienced of unemployment. We've been running it in Scotland for 2.5 years now. We've had 100 young people that have gone through it, and we've had a 97% success rate of getting them into employment in the rail industry. But what we find when we go to recruit these young people is that they have no understanding or knowledge of our industry. They literally think if you're in the rail industry, you're a train driver, or you're just out digging up the tracks, and they don't really understand. And once they start the programme and go through it, they are 110% determined to get into our industry and stay in our industry, and they have stayed in the industry. We've got some fantastic success stories of some of these young people that have come in, people that have been care experienced, which I didn't even know was a barrier to work until I started this programme, but it is a significant barrier. People who are neurodiverse, basically everything, and they've come in, what they really, really like about it, and this is what we don't sell enough as an industry, is that it's a career for life. So a lot of them have had jobs, but it's jobs, it's cash in hand, it's shifts here, shifts there in construction and delivery, McDonald's. I actually think McDonald's probably hate QTS now because we keep taking all their staff. But when they see that it's actually a career that they can have, even though they've not, or most of them have not got formal qualifications, or That's the one thing that really makes them want to come into our industry and stay in our industry. And that's something that I think we need to be selling much more than we do.
Yeah.
If I could just expand on the point around their lack of awareness of the opportunity in the railway sector in terms of the breadth of roles they could do. The other thing to consider here is, as in terms of a barrier, is equally when you look at the kind of the cultural restrictions, and what I mean by that specifically is if you're coming from a South or an East Asian heritage background particularly, there's an expectation from your family that you're going to go in a certain career paths, and rail is not one of those career paths. So it's as much around engaging with the young people, but equally it's about engaging with their families and their communities to help them understand the potential for them to join the sector. Because at the moment, they're going to be going, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be this, you're going to be that, you're going to be a doctor, you know, you're going to be an optician, you're going to be a dentist, you're going to be those, they're encouraging their kids to follow those kind of career paths from that community. They're not aware of the range of jobs they could be doing in our sector.
Well, I think moving on from that as well, if you look at the other sort of industries that you look would be transitional from the railway, your likes of defence, aviation, nuclear, they actually already have higher barriers to entry due to the clearances needed, the requirements to gather those clearances as well. So rail, essentially, we were talking about it earlier, the main barrier to actually anything in rail is PTS, which is just being physically fit to be on track. But then there's a massive array of jobs as well that you can do in offices and away from the track as well. So there really is a scope of work across the board for anyone in the railway without there being a certain criteria that needs to be met. So in terms of opportunities, it is one where, you know, like we've discussed, people who have come from foreign nations because there's no security restrictions on that, people with disabilities, people from minority backgrounds, they can all get involved in the railway, and they can. It doesn't matter what job it is, there are opportunities there as well. So,
yeah, absolutely.
And then some of it's about, so do I know rail exists? I say rail sometimes is like the best kept secret because it actually pays really, really well for young people, but people don't really know what jobs there are in rail. So as you say, you'll have the stuff like those train drivers, track workers, but the scope of the opportunities is vast, but people don't really know about it. And then there's a perception about who works in rail. And because we've got such a low proportion of young people, and because we've got such a low proportion of people from minoritised backgrounds, because we've got such a low proportion of women, when you then look at it, is it an industry that people look at and go, oh, that's where I want to go and work because I can see people like me there. So we have to work extra hard to say, no, this is somewhere for everyone. And then make sure when they come in, they don't experience discrimination and disadvantaged and oversized high-vis jackets because they're only in one size, which is male, and all of those sorts of things that
absolutely
put people off.
It's that old saying, you can't become what you can't see. If you can't see the career options in the first place, but if you also can't see yourself in those career options, then how would you ever know that that was an avenue that was open to you? I remember when I used to lead education sessions in schools, I used to say right at the top, what are the jobs in the railway industry? And I'd always get the driver. I'd always get the man that checks the tickets. It was always the man that checks the tickets. And once I got the manager. So those are apparently the 3 jobs in the rail sector. That's it. So there's a huge amount of work to do on that front. But I think it leads us quite nicely on to our second topic, which is rail actually attractive as a career option? And I think it's quite hard for those of us in this room to kind of conceptualize not being in rail and trying to look at it objectively. But is it attractive to young people, and to your point again, to those that are guiding them into the sector? Do we have an image problem, generally speaking, and how do we combat that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, just briefly, I think we are attractive if you looked at what we can provide them. We are attractive if you look to Ruth's point around the opportunity financially, although, again, there's a question to ask young people's priorities around what matters to them when they first join an industry. But we are attractive, but we don't present ourselves in an attractive fashion. I think the distinction to make is the opportunity is vast, but we don't make that apparent to those that may be looking for employment. It's just my kind of thoughts on just initially on that.
I think there is a perception, though, that it's not an attractive industry. You know, working night shifts, working Saturday nights, working in the cold, the wet, getting dirty. You know, that does, and I hear a lot of people, and it drives me nuts when I hear that, you know, women don't want to work in the industry because of these things. There's plenty of men don't want to be out on a Saturday night getting wet and dirty either. But that is very much the perception, and people do not see the wider picture of all the roles that there are that actually don't all involve doing those things. I think you really should start by being out and understanding what actually happens out there. But there's so many roles that don't involve Saturday nights. You know, I've never done a Saturday night shift. Maybe writing a tender or something, but not out on a track. So there are plenty of roles like that, but the perception is that it's not a particularly attractive industry.
I think building on from what you've both said, it's the promotion that we lack at the moment. I think if you look at Andrew Haynes, for an example, who started as a left luggage clerk and is now the CEO of Network Rail. If we were to promote those sort of opportunities and that sort of development, and you look at the jobs he's had in the build-up to being CEO, it's a whole array and it's a vast array. So that should be the stuff that we're promoting, the opportunities to develop, that you can start as someone here and actually essentially run one of the biggest organisations in the UK. So that opportunity is vast, and it's the things we should be focusing on rather than the bad media and the bad press that we get with, like you say, the strikes and the delays and that you usually see in the media.
And I think we've not had a fun ride in the media over the last 5 years or so, have we? And even during COVID, actually, rail was a key service that kept running, but it wasn't really recognised in the same way as some other services were. So if you looked in the press and you look at rail, you'd see, as you say, the strikes, you'd see the increase in violence and abuse towards frontline colleagues. You'd see the shift patterns, the lack of flexibility, and we're not very good at being flexible in terms of shift patterns and flexible working and those sorts of things. And lots of research around what do younger people want from work. They want work that can fit around their lives, so it's not work-life balance anymore, it's how does work fit into my life. And we're not flexible enough and agile enough to change and adapt to that in the same way as we should be. But then you do have people, like if you go into a train operator, loads of people will start on the gate line at stations and they won't be there for much more than Odis included. And then you might become a customer experience trainer and do inductions for people like me, and which is what Odis did. But lots of people start on the gate line and move from there. So they'll either then go to train manager and potentially driver, or they'll go into leadership roles. And there is that opportunity for movement, and that does happen quite a lot. So once you get in, and a lot of the apprentices do that as well, don't they?
Absolutely,
so a lot of the operational apprentices start in that way, and then you see them in other bits of the business. So it's almost getting the word out there that happens and broadening out who knows about it to apply for it in the first place.
So how do we do that? I think that's the big question here. If we're saying rail is attractive once you know the options, and if we're saying that rail is attractive because of a high level of pay, because of flexibility between roles, but we're acknowledging, I think, that it's a best kept secret, as you said. How do we make it not a secret? How do we actually tackle the heart of this issue? How do we make it so that young people, the people advising them, teachers, tutors, parents, people in the community, how do we get the word out there?
I think that there's a lot of work being done by individual companies and organisations. In NSAR, have got the Roots into Rail, our own organisation. I know many of the supply chain are in and out of schools and colleges. I mean, we've got somebody whose full-time job is going into schools, and particularly primary schools, and trying to educate the educators and the parents as well. So we do a lot of that, and I think there's a huge amount of that going on in the industry, which is fantastic. And I think I probably said the same thing last year, but I do feel we need a whole industry approach with the same consistent story. Almost an advertising campaign. You see it for the armed forces as adverts on the TV. I feel that if you had TV adverts with people telling their stories about Andrew Haynes or anybody, there's loads of that in the industry, where they've started, where they've got to. That to me is the sort of approach we need. It needs to be industry led, but as a whole.
Yeah. And I think you go to where the people are as well. So you go into the schools, you go on to, I don't even know if young people are on TikTok anymore.
They are on TikTok,
Snapchat, Blue Sky if they've got a moral core and don't want to be on Meta products, Instagram. But you go out there, you get the creativity from young people in the industry. So you don't do it in the way that like a 40-year-old woman, I'm not 40 anymore either, I'm making myself younger, 40-something woman might do it. You go, right, okay, what do the kids want to hear? How do we do it in their language, appeal to them? But at the same time, we then also need to make sure that we are making sure that the process all the way through is easier. So we know young people often have a harder time getting through the interview process. So how do we support people through that process? How do we support people when they come into the industry in the first place? So that it's not, well, I went for rail and this happened to me, therefore I didn't. So it's not just the what you say in the first place, it's then how you live and breathe that through the process people go through.
I think there's a piece around acknowledging when you go to a different forum or a different community, you're going to be saying different things. If you're going into schools of a certain age, it's around that engagement around the STEM piece for young, for young girls and things like that, and minority communities. But equally, if you're talking to a group of young people that maybe are at school or college age, actually they may be more interested about the social value impact that the rail has, because they're going to be more values-led and principle-led. So actually, it's about saying to them, you're joining an industry that is one of the most carbon neutral options of transportation. You can cite all the great work that we do through the community partnerships and things like that, and that they will care about that, and they'll know that they're contributing to something that's greater than. And obviously, Ruth mentioned like Youth Futures Foundation, so I support them from a employer advisory board perspective, and they do a lot of research around what good work environment means to young people, and they've got a different hierarchy of needs than you or I might have because of where they are in their life. So it's about understanding actually what matters to them, and can we help them deliver that for themselves within the career they want to have. And also I think there's an opportunity in terms of, we don't live in a society where young people are going to stay in the same job for the rest of their lives. And as we come together over time, all things permitted, it's really about saying, actually, you can start off there, but you could move to there, or there. You can change roles, you can change skill sets. So they don't leave us. They might leave that department or that even the operator, but they won't leave the industry. Because the other part of it is actually keeping them once they're in and making sure the culture we've got is right for them so they don't leave us after a year or 2 years, or if they're returning to work as well. It's not just about the young people, but equally those that are returning to work, particularly women that are returning to work. How do we attract them and how do we keep them?
I did it wasn't speed dating, that would be really inappropriate, but it's the equivalent of speed dating for a sixth form, where employers went in and they had like 8 minutes at each table and they'd go round, and I was far less popular than the lady who was giving out free soap, which was a little bit worrying. But I had 8 minutes with these group of people, young people that were coming around, and they only came to me because they got told they had to come to me, and they didn't have a choice. These were the tables you had to go round, and you could see they were like, I work in rail, and I'm like, oh. So I started by saying to them, well, what do you want to do? And everything they came up, I want to be an engineer, I want to be in HR, I want to be whatever. Everything they came up with, I said, well, in rail, you can do that because you can do it here, and these are the sorts of jobs. Yeah. And so it's almost, you can almost do it through a professional lens as well. And like Odis said, you need to do it differently with different groups of people.
Absolutely.
But I didn't trump soap, unfortunately, but hopefully I've maybe persuaded a few other people to join rail.
Like you say, building on from that, so the YRP do a lot where we do interrail, so going into universities, career fairs, into schools, and rather than just talking to them about the railway, I always find the best thing to do is ask, well, what do you want to do? And you'll have them go, I want to be a software engineer, I want to work for Google, I want to be a cybersecurity engineer, I want to do X, Y, Z. Well, you can do that in the railway, right? No? What do you mean? It's blue collar, it's working in a station. No, we've got all these infrastructures as well that you can. And actually, there's a load of great grad schemes that give you the opportunities that you can do these things that you want to do as well. And I think it's very important not just to look at how do we attract people into rail, same as what you were saying. Mm-hmm. It's even more imperative that once we invest and obviously share that knowledge with people, that we keep them engaged in the railway. So that's that cultural shift internally. Whereas I've spoke to a lot of managers and, for example, a signalling designer, their manager's never going to want them to move out of signalling design because it's already a niche, and it's there's not many people that can specialise in this area. But then if it's the difference between keeping them in a company working in signalling design or moving them into maybe project engineering or then losing them to a different company or to a different sector, there's got to be that cultural shift where actually we continue to attract and develop our engineers, our commercial staff, rather than them getting bored and then wanting to go and explore something else.
I think that the hard part going to schools is if they say they want to be a YouTuber, then I think we're scuppered.
We have comms departments.
You can actually be a YouTuber.
There are a lot of rail YouTubers.
Yeah.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
But this is the thing, I used to say going into sessions in schools, every job that exists outside of rail exists within rail in one form or another, whether you have a more mathematical, analytical brain, whether you have a more creative brain, whether you're a communicator, an educator, whatever that is, you will find a role in rail that is suitable for your skill set and for what you want to do with your life. So just before we open to questions from the audience, I have a final question I want to ask. Because we are at Rail Live and because there are a huge number of contractors, SMEs here, tier ones, a real range, what are the barriers to employment by the companies that are here today? So are there different barriers to some of these organisations versus, say, a train operating company? What are those barriers, and do different companies, I suppose, have different levels of risk around that engagement? Are there different approaches, or are we still saying whole industry approach is what we need? So what's that balance like?
I think we do need a whole industry approach, but specifically my day job at QTS and our Real Skills Academy, what I have seen over the last year is that a lot of the supply chain are more reluctant to invest in bringing young people in, apprentices, trainees, graduates, because of the uncertainty around their work banks and the pipeline that we've all experienced going from CP6 into CP7. And that's particularly our last programme of young people that completed. A lot of the contractors that would normally snap them up are saying, we're being a bit careful just now, we're not taking young people on. I'm trying to say to them, you need to see the bigger picture, because if you take them on now, by the time things the floodgates will open, the boom and bust, it's always the same in the industry. They'll have more experience and they'll be ready to be a good part of your team at that point. But there's definitely a reluctance just now, and I think there's no point in having an elephant in the room. It needs to be discussed. It's all very well saying we're going to attract all these young people into our industry and run programmes and traineeships and apprenticeships, but if at the end of that they're not getting work, then we're making it an even less attractive industry. So we do need to be very aware of it.
I was going to say the same thing, but from the apprenticeship perspective, when it comes to supply chain versus operators versus Network Rail, their ability to pull people in through those means, because I think exactly that the supply chain they're not getting involved as much, and you Futures are doing research in that area as well. To understand what their barriers are to attracting, I guess, all ages, but particularly the young people.
Yeah.
I think the last 12, 18 months has been very interesting, especially from a recruitment side. It's actually been quite interesting that from my side, I've seen SMEs have actually been recruiting probably more than what the large principal contractors have. Really? And a lot of that is due to sort of the compliance and sign-off from head office, whereas the SMEs, their levels of hierarchy, if they do see an opportunity to attract a really good talent, they can sort of go, well, okay, maybe the next 12 months, 18 months it's going to be slightly quieter, but we've got an opportunity now and we can take it. Whereas a lot of these principal contractors, the large consultancies, there's so many different levels of hierarchy to get it signed off to actually be able to bring someone in. Yeah. And with the risk that there is at the moment with the work banks and not having a clear picture of what that's going to look like, head offices aren't quite willing to take the risk, because although it is a lesser risk for them, it's still perceived as a risk, and the opportunity to risk is slightly less. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't know if anyone from Railway Industry Association is in the room, but they did a study a few months ago of transport leaders. So I think it was top 100 transport leaders in different organisations. And the result came back that I think it was 60% of those organisations said that they were freezing or slowing down hiring over the 12 months from last year to, I think it was mid this year at some point. So I think we do have to be realistic about what that overall slowdown and that industry uncertainty also means for things like diversity, things like, bridging the skills gap and bringing younger people into the industry. So
I think there is, obviously the work that you do, for example, there are, as you were saying, there are loads of pockets of really good initiatives. Another example is, Network Rail partnering with TPE and the Trans-Pennine route, and they have an apprenticeship program there that actually means you get to go to the operator, you get to go to the infrastructure, you get to go to supply chain, and that's on a cyclic process. So they're really good examples where they're spreading the load, basically. Yeah. So they're all covering, they're working together to reduce the challenge of one of them doing it independently. And they're doing that with a university in that region as well, called Plan B. But it's those kind of things that we should be looking at as case studies to say, well, how do we replicate that? How do we get other people involved in those kind of programs? I think I'm not going to solutions, but my head's going there. So.
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. Well, I hope the audience have got some questions for us. If you do have a question, please pop your hand up, wait for a microphone to come to you, introduce yourself, and then ask your question. I don't know who was first. I think you were all at exactly the same time.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Ruth Tank, Epion Consulting. You've spoken quite a lot about the attraction problem, but what are the barriers to retention once you have people in the rail industry, and how are you addressing that? I'm thinking particularly around cultural issues. If you are from a diverse background, you can't be what you can't see. How might you be tackling some of those issues?
So I think you can chip in,
No,
Odis. I think so. The culture, the rail industry is not diverse. So when you join it, you're going to be, and you're from a more diverse background, or if you're a woman, you're going to be in a minority, and that's always going to be difficult. So attraction is key. How you support and develop people is really important. One of the big hurdles is promotion into management, and we are seeing disparities there by ethnicity, which we need to address and do more on. And that's where things like balanced shortlists, balanced interview panels, and all of those sorts of things come into play and are really important to look at that. There's a figure that Youth Futures have produced which says that 73% of young people, if they've experienced, from an ethnically minoritized background, if they've experienced discrimination in their employer, they will leave it. So there's a real risk, and that's why we've got to be really, really hard on zero tolerance for poor behaviours. Which I think people find difficult, but it's the right thing to do. And obviously we're in an environment where Trump and Farage and the sort of anti-EDI stuff, but actually, ultimately, it's about being kind to people. And if you can't be kind and provide an environment in which people thrive, then we should be addressing that, because who wants to work in that sort of environment? So I think there's lots for us to do. Some of it's about how we support and nurture individuals, tackle some of the systemic barriers for progression, but also how we tackle issues when they arise, and be really open about addressing poor culture and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Building on that point around the challenges for certain communities, we know that, again, through the research that Youth Futures have done, that if you're from an ethnic minority group and you're in an apprenticeship, you're more likely to drop out before completing it than any other characteristic. There was even some research done by someone that used to lead apprenticeships at BT, and they found that in a particular region of the country, they had the largest dropout of apprenticeships, and they thought it was about the region, and they realised actually all of the people that were dropping out were from ethnic minority groups and from that region. So there was actually an intersectional piece to that. But it is about the culture. It is about us being very careful that we're not over-promising and delivering about the culture. So we're saying, come to us, come to us, come to us. But actually, we don't, once you're in and you're ingrained, I've seen countless people leave the sector because they've not got the support they need. And we have various, all of us are doing development programs to focus on those frontline colleagues to get them into new careers, get them into new roles. But while they're initiatives, they're always, it's never going to be systemic. They need to be actually, you don't need a development program for someone that's an ethnic minority group, because actually there are no barriers to them progressing anyway through the regular channels. Whereas what we're doing now, and it's not unique to us, I think it's a lot of sectors are kind of having to backpedal by opening those doors up in a more forceful way, because the system doesn't allow them to do that automatically. And equally, as we, not that it's about ticking a box, but of course we get closer to an ethnicity pay gap mandatory, disability pay gap mandatory. It's a good thing for us in terms of it's going to force people to be more considerate about these things, but it shouldn't have needed this to occur for people to kind of... Yeah.
There's a phrase that gets used in safety quite a lot, which is what you walk past is what you're prepared to accept. And I think that applies to culture as well. So I think it's incumbent on everyone in the rail industry to go, actually, that made me feel a bit uncomfortable. I need to do something about it, rather than going, huh.
I think Rich Green used to always say, what you permit, you promote, what you condone, you own. Yeah. It's the same thing as saying that, yeah.
Absolutely.
I think on top of that as well, it's so important to then promote these organisations, because if you can't see people similar to yourself in positions of seniority, it's so important then to go to these organisations and be involved in organisations where there are people who are going through sort of the similar path as to what you are at the moment, and be involved, speak to them about issues that you're facing, see what they've done to sort of support those issues, and from the development side as well. So hopefully that then supports on the retention of these minority groups in the industries as well.
It's where things like your non-monetary employee value proposition comes into play, because actually that should be watertight when it comes to inclusivity, because if it isn't, you're going to fail again and again and again and again. And obviously we're in a position where, you know, that conversation is going on right now for the future, but the right thing to be in the room to help them understand what needs to happen for that to land properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just this lady on the second row. Then Tony. As long as it's a nice question.
Emily Blackwell, I'm a lead portfolio manager within Capital Delivery Network Rail, Wales and Western. Part of my role is actually do a lot of professional development, so leading grads and getting year in industry this year, which is really interesting. I guess my question is more of a statement that I think the barrier is almost that our job adverts, I think they're in some ways quite poor, because I find a lot of them almost need to take people through what they actually say. It will be like, even for like a PMA, it will be like, you will lead on the planning of access. It's like, no, my PMA is going to be there to help guide my project manager on access. So there's a lot around that you have to then translate our adverts, but also then lead in with what transferable skills there are. I have to do a lot around kind of, even within just like the 25 and above, talking about transferable skills. Like, you know, our job adverts lead into, you must have this essential skill. And people are like, oh, but I don't have that. And then you talk the person through it, and it's like, no, you've got great communication skills, you've got stakeholder management, this, you know, think about your transferable skills. And I don't think we lean enough into that space of actually, yes, you've talked about kind of getting people interested in rail of, oh, you want to be a Power Apps developer, you can do that in the rail, but it's then, well, you've got a biology degree, come work in the railway, because you've got the analytics there, you've got the way to transfer data, you've got a way to look at biodiversity, come work in the railway. I don't think we do enough in that transferable skill space. I guess commentary on that.
Yeah, agree completely. I mean, I think it goes broader than that. You know, we often have conversations in the kind of recruitment attraction piece from an EDI lens to say, you know, your situational judgment tests, your psychometric testing, what barriers does that create to those that are neurodivergent, for example? Is an apprenticeship the right approach to go for attracting a young person, or is it work experience or internships? Because actually they get to do on-the-job experience for a window of time, and they can evidence their skills through that, which is more beneficial for those that are neurodivergent, as opposed to a theoretical question as to what they might do in a scenario they've never been in before. So job descriptions, but also the onboarding process and how we attract them into the pipeline, all those things absolutely need to be looked at. So agree, I guess is the short version. I gave you the long version, of course.
I think you're absolutely right, because half of the stuff you talked about, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, which sounds really bad, doesn't it? So how do we translate it out of railway language into non-railway language so people can look at it? One of the things that we found when we, at Great Western, we run the Prince's Trust, now the King's Trust, and there was a disparity in the number of people who were getting employment afterwards compared to South Eastern, for example, that had a really high conversion rate. And some of it is because we were making them go through the full interview process, and then they were getting knocked out the process. But what we also put in was some mentoring for people as they went through the process, and that was a really good way of basically decoding railway language so that people could go, oh, actually, you just want me to be good at communicating. Yeah, I'm good at communicating, therefore I can do this. So some of it is just about derailwaying the language a bit. That's not even a word, but you know what I mean.
Because it does create a bias, because what you and you know, I'm a proponent of the railway family as a concept, but it literally is the railway family, because those that know the code are the children of those that are already in the industry, as opposed to those that are coming from outside of it. So we do need to decodify it in a way that they'll be able to understand over time.
There's also an element of de-skilling it. Like, I don't have a degree, but I've managed to work my way through. You know, I started at 24 as a document controller, went to planning assistant, PMA, SPM, PM, you know, no formal qualifications to my name. Obviously, it might become a barrier as I want to move upwards, but I'm always that thing of like, you can go in with you know, customer service.
Yep.
You know, but it's the and that's what I mean, is that transferable.
Yeah.
You know, you get a lot of people and it's like, oh, here's my CV.
No.
It's like, I mean, CVs alone is just a whole other question. We're currently doing quite a bit of recruitment, and I've seen about 150 CVs, and I can probably say about 10% of them were, you know, okay. The rest of them, not so much.
Well,
Brilliant.
I think it's a really good point that you raise about the transferable skills, but then I think it does come back to almost a cultural thing as well, because the barrier to entry there is always going to sit with the hiring manager, because there will be hiring managers that go, yes, look, we're happy to see people from different industries, different experience, but then there's also going to be hiring managers that go, well, actually, I want someone who can do the job right away, who knows everything, and we want the perfect finished article. So there's always going to be that cultural aspect that actually, with the skill shortage that we have, with the people leaving the industry, maybe these perfect people aren't going to exist, and maybe it is going to take 3 months, 6 months to train and develop them, but we can find the right personalities and the right skill sets, and that's then when you say about de-skilling the roles or breaking them down to people who understand from outside the railway as well.
And when do you start to move towards strengths-based interviewing rather
Exactly.
than competency-based and those sorts of things? And how do we make that?
Because we're very good at recruiting from aviation. We're very good at recruiting from other engineering sectors. We're very good at recruiting from the military, from the police force, from emergency services, because they're a shoe-in. They're very easy. We can put them in, lock them in. They know the regime. They know the protocols. But we're not inviting a lot of people to the table when we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just with an eye to time, then we'll come to Tony, and then we'll go to our last question over here. Just here in the front.
Good morning. Thanks very much. Tony Lee from Salesforce. Bit disappointed Google came out from the youngsters. We beat Google to number 2, actually, so we're number 1, actually, in terms of organisations young people want to work for.
Have you just taken the mic to do a shout? Is that what this is?
There's a valid point. So I'm curious from the panelist's point of view. So digital rail, AI, automation, green transport are things that haven't quite been mentioned. These are the things of the future of rail. Given the cachet that organisations like mine and Google have, how can the private sector support the rail industry to attract younger talent in and potentially move into rail on a more permanent basis?
Question.
It's a really good question. So part of the challenge is we should be using technology much more, and obviously we've got programs like digital signalling, and I'm sure there's lots of it here, but it's not the image that's associated with rail at the moment. And I think that's where the supply chain really helps, because actually the supply chain's got the ability to innovate probably more so than Network Rail, and certainly more than the train operators, just by the virtue of freedom to go off and do R&D without your budgets being tightly controlled and all of those sorts of things. There is GBRX that's been established now, which is there to be sort of an innovation hub. So I think that's an area where supply chain skill set is really, really key, because you don't need to have it all sitting within the infrastructure manager and the train operator. You want people to bring in that. And then hopefully that will open people's eyes to what else there is in rail and how everyone in rail can help make an impact for it. I think the one caution on AI is making sure that we design AI in a way that doesn't embed existing systemic discrimination.
Agreed.
And I think that's a real issue, in that we'll take the data set and the mindset of today and just bed it in forever into AI. And I've just finished reading a horrifying book by Laura Bates on the new age of sexism, which explores some of those sorts of things. So we have to go into it in a mindful way, particularly in recruitment and those sorts of things. But it's an opportunity to get more diversity into that side of things, so that we're embedding and coding and building the right stuff that we want moving forward.
I mean, so I have a bit of a conflicting opinion of AI. I love it. I'm a nerd, a massive tech nerd. I love all that stuff. Equally, I'm very conscious of the fact that to run these machines requires a lot of water to cool them, water that we'd be drinking otherwise. So I've got to be honest with you, full transparency, it's a paradox in my brain when it comes to things like AI and technology, when we look at our social responsibility versus what's going to help us be attractive to young people that want to get into those particular fields. I don't have a solution to what I've just told you. I don't for myself. But certainly I think there are those things to consider around the long-term impact of those kind of things on what you see outside, basically. So that's my hot take on that one.
I think moving away from the AI topic and going more on the digital rail side, I think digital rail is very interesting, but the issue with the digital rail and the innovation in the railway is the time that it usually takes these products for product acceptance, which you often find there's a lot of SMEs that are sort of exploring the innovative side, the new technologies, but then for them to actually grow, there's that period between coming up with the technology, so that 2 to 5 years down the line where actually they're able to sell and apply the technology onto the railway, or then sell it to a principal contractor as well. So actually bringing young people and that next generation in and supporting that technology, it's difficult because they've not necessarily done a funding, because a lot of these companies that are sort of supplying that next level of innovation and technology are often quite small and quite tight when it comes to profit margins and actually being able to survive until they can sell their product. So I think that's a bit of a challenge there from that side.
I do think, though, that, you know, what we were talking about earlier about sort of advertising the industry to attract young people, those are things that young people find very attractive. That's what they're interested in. So we don't talk about it enough. And again, from our own experience, we do a lot of innovation at QTS. And a lot of young people that come in when they see what we're doing with our drones and our CCTV stuff, and, you know, not the kind of AI high level, but going towards that and certainly using AI in a lot of that, that's something they find really attractive. So it is something that we should be bringing into the kind of real sales pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Great question, Tony. Right, last question, please. Just the lady here, and then we will be closing.
Hello, my name's Sarah. I just wondered I found some barriers to, I come from a different industry and I'm really keen on rail, and I've noticed, I echo what that lady said there. What is your feeling on people coming from experienced backgrounds trying to break into rail and decoding the language? I found that quite hard, and sometimes I feel like it's almost a closed shop. So I've come here today to put that question to you.
So I'm technically a young rail professional because I've only been in rail 7 years, which I think is a long time now. But it's not. But I came from other industries, so I've worked in defence and higher education and the civil service, and I came in as HR director as well. So I was sitting in an exec where they're talking about rail stuff. And I was like, I don't know this. So you don't have to do this, but I did the IRO certificate in railway operations, because I was like, I just want enough of an understanding of the operational speak that's going on, so that when I hear it, but also ask loads of questions, because people in rail love explaining how rail works, like absolutely love it. So I'd be sitting there and going, what was this again? Remind me what an absolute block signalling is. Do I need to know? No, you don't need to know that bit. All right, don't worry about it. But people love explaining it. So I think there is a way of decoding it. And then I think what I'm trying to retain is the desire not to speak in a railway language, so that I'm then helping others as well moving forward, which I don't always manage. And then sometimes I sound a bit daft. So I'll talk about the Intercity Express trains on Great Western, and I'll say, oh, it's the 800 class, or the big green ones with the yellow pointy nose, to just try and do it in a different way. But I think rail does have lots of people from different industries. It might not seem like it, but absolutely ask, because a lot of the stuff as well is not like there's reasons things happen, and sometimes it's because there's a really good reason, because there was an incident that happened 20 years ago and therefore we need to do this, and other times it's just this is the way it's always been done. So we need people who are going to come in and be curious and ask questions to help us get better.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it you can't avoid. You know, we're an operational industry, we're a safety-led industry, so some of that language is not going to disappear, but absolutely when it can, it should. So when it can be simplified, it should. I mean, as Ruth mentioned, I worked in L&D for 5 years, and I used to train tickets, rail cards, geography, all that stuff, and it's a lot. Even if your job is to deliver that for the customer, it's a lot. Some of it you can't avoid, but I think where you can, you should try and simplify it.
Again, I think it's something we should be taking on board for trying to attract other people into the industry, because getting people from other industries, I came from construction, I'm just outside of the YRP now. I've been in the industry for 12 years, but I felt that people were speaking a foreign language, but I did just ask everything. But I do think it's something we should be taking on board. If we want to attract people from other industries, we need to sort of simplify it a bit and make it less off-putting to come into the industry.
I think the other thing is go out and about and be a customer. Which is easier to do when you get free travel, admittedly. But go out and about and be a customer, because actually being out and being at stations, being on board trains, when things are working well, when things are not working well, is a really good way of seeing how rail works, how it works at its best, and and when it doesn't work at its best. And that for me, I was a commuter for years before I joined the rail industry, so I kind of came into it thinking, well, I know rail because I've experienced it as a customer, and ultimately what we're all trying to do is provide a great service for customers and community. So having that lens is always a really helpful lens to start with.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect point, I think, to close the session on as well. So thank you so much. Some really engaging questions. I think thank you so much to the panel, if we can give them a hand as well.